Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to talk maybe a little bit about the map and to try to situate you a little bit in terms of the cultures and peoples that we're dealing with here. The colored areas on the map, which is also on the back of the brochure, probably represent, in terms of geographical area, the New England states and a chunk of New York State. And we're talking about the Yoruba people in western Nigeria, represented by all the pieces along that wall. They number somewhere around 20 million. The Ebo people in green and behind me here, among whom I worked for about 2.5 years all told, constitute somewhere between 12 and 15 or 18 million people. The census taking in Nigeria is notoriously corrupt, along with almost everything else in Nigeria, unfortunately. So we don't really know how many there are. But if you look at the Ebo, for example, and compare their geographical area to the Chamba number well under 1 million people, maybe 500,000. But they occupy an area larger than is occupied by 15 million Ebo people. So the Ebo have been pressed for land for many, many centuries, and this helps to account for some aspects of Ebo art. So I'd like to talk under 3 rubrics here that are very closely interrelated. Form, structure of the objects themselves, what you're looking at. Function, how they were used, what they mean to the local people, and to some extent, what they mean to us. And then history. And of course, all of these 3 are intertwined. Starting with form, and these ideas are explored in a little more depth than I can give them here in the brochure. If we start with form, you note as you look around that there are some pieces like this skin-covered headdress right here, Janus headdress from the Ejikam people over here along the Cross River. There are 2 rivers that define this territory, 3 actually. The Great Niger River, which flows out into the Niger Delta here. This is the Niger Delta. This whole area, you can see historically, is the Niger Delta. A huge, enormous river, more than 1 mile across in many places. The Benue River, which is its major tributary, and that waters the Benue Valley, of course, represented by the peoples in the yellow-orange area in the center of the room. Those quite abstract headdresses, these ones here, and the animal composite mask over here. Is my pointer working for people? So the naturalistic side of African art, or of Nigerian art, is represented well by this mask with 2 heads, probably 1 male, 1 female, looking in opposite directions and covered with antelope skin. It's partially the polished skin that gives the naturalistic feel. Then compare the abstract side to these shrine figures from the Mumuye peoples of northern Nigeria, of the Benue Valley, again, this area over here, where there is obvious human anatomical reference, but the sculptors were entirely free to invent the forms that you see before you. And one of the interesting things that Dalila has done in mounting this show is to bring in 3 Mumuye figures that are structurally and formally very, very different. This one is very dynamic, with the arms thrust backward and forward and sort of forming a kind of cage around the figure. This one, the arms are kind of hanging down straight, and here the arms are bent, but not with the same dynamism that you see here. The faces are different, the heads are different. All of them have long necks, which is one of the Pan-African characteristics that is associated with female beauty. Long-necked women are, for reasons not quite clear to me, and they were also appreciated in Europe too, in the Renaissance and post-Renaissance times. Although all our necks are about the same length, aren't they, actually, anatomically? If you pull the shoulder muscles down, it looks as though you have a longer neck. But I think most people have the same number of vertebrae. So necks are approximately the same length. In any case, this is an aesthetic criterion which runs through many different African peoples. And you look around at these Ebo figures, they all have much longer necks than in life. And this is the case pretty much across Africa. So you have an animal mask over here that I pointed to, and a similar kind of animal mask here, but this one is almost entirely abstract. You don't catch, unless you point them out, and I will, the parts of the animal. So this is the beak form right here in front, this boxy, and that corresponds, of course, to this. These are the horns, which are attached at the rear, and in this example, the one on the right here, in this example, they don't look like horns at all, but that's what they represent. And of course, this is the mouth of this particular example. And these masks are either worn flat on top of the head, sometimes diagonally as they are displayed here, and sometimes straight up and down. So there are different ways of dancing, and there are different interpretations of the masks depending on how they are worn. Okay, I want to get back. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. I wanted to talk a little bit about the different peoples. The Yoruba, who are against the wall here, are organized into city-states or kingdoms, and they are urbanized and have been urbanized for many, many centuries. They have farms out in the fields, but they're kings, and this is a monarchical society. There were originally, according to legend, 16 original Yoruba kings, but there are many more than that now. And the kings are known for their beadwork. So we have a beaded crown here that once belonged to a Yoruba king, and a pair of beaded sandals as well underneath the crown. Both kings and diviners who had a kind of edge into royalty among the Yoruba used a lot of beadwork, and this was a signature element for royals. Most of the peoples, however, are agriculturalists, and many had no chiefs, and of course no kings, and not even any chiefs. Other peoples in this region had some chiefs, but they were often the heads of lineages, extended families, rather than elected chiefs. So the socio-political spectrum is very broad in this area, as is the numbers of people represented, and the types of, pardon me, and the types of art that they produce can be quite different as well. So if you look around, you will see that there are no thoroughly and absolutely naturalistic or lifelike carvings in the room. Even the skin-covered headdress, the facial features are magnified a little bit in comparison with real human facial features. And I think that there's a functional reason for that. Almost none of these objects represent real human beings. All of these objects share a kind of inventive genesis. If a figure represents an ancestral being, nobody knows what the ancestors look like anymore. They don't seem to be the same in their ancestral world as they are in our world. So it doesn't do to have a deity, and many of the figures here are deities or the children of deities, or sometimes, as in the case of the Yoruba staff that's over against this wall here, devotees of deities. They are not real people. They are not portraits. Portraiture in the art of Africa is very, very rare. There was some imitative naturalistic portraiture in southwestern Nigeria among the Yoruba people between about the 11th and 14th or 15th centuries AD in a culture called Ife that some of you know about. But this is an anomaly. Most African art is quite strongly stylized, more or less. The Mumuye examples are heavily stylized. These masks are heavily stylized. The Ebo masks here are heavily stylized. These ones, also Ebo, but in a very distinct subgroup called Afikpo, on the eastern side of Ebo country, near the Cross River, are very, very strongly stylized to the point of abstraction. This one is a human face, but the nose and the mouth are projecting plugs, and there's a knife that is attached to the top of the head coming up from the forehead. The eyes and the nose in this one are, the face is entirely flat, kind of scooped out, not naturalistic at all. But these represent different kinds of spirits. And most of the masks here are not human beings at all, but representatives of the spirit world, either with a very strong ancestral component or spirits of nature, water spirits, pardon me, or spirits of the wild, spirits of the wilderness, land spirits, associated often with animalistic power. So that is a brief introduction to some of the formal variety. Many of these objects are composites. They are not a single being. For example, this is a mask called Friend of the Village or Elephant of the Village. And it is a reconstituted elephant with the tusks in their correct positions coming out from beside the mouth, but the trunk has been transposed to the forehead in what I think is quite a wonderfully creative idea. Why is it there? Who knows? But there are lots of these masks, at least a couple of hundred of them have been recorded, and they all have that same iconography. And I might talk a little bit about these masks, because this mask and the three others that I've pointed out already, the Chamba Mask here with a domical head and bush buffalo or bush cow horns coming out the back and a crocodile snout coming out the front. It is a composite mask. These ones here from the Jukun and Goimai peoples are also composite. Multiple animals of the wilderness being brought together as an expression of power. The power, the medicines associated with the wilderness, where herbs and leaves and other materials are gathered for the protection of people, for healing and so forth. These masks, which are referred to in our trade as three-part horizontal masks, are worn usually horizontally or diagonally on the head in this position that all of them are displayed in, or they are worn strictly horizontally. The three parts are the head, very clearly shown in the Chamba example with that dome-like head which represents the skull of a human being. So they all have a human component, although it's very hard to see any human component in the two examples there. This one has human eyes and a human nose. They all have at least two animals, a human being and an elephant in this case, a bush cow, a crocodile. Some of them, like the Sinufo fire spitter that some of you know of, have several other animals involved too, warthogs and other, sometimes two or three different kinds of antelopes, all aggregated together to represent the power of the bush, the power of wilderness, and the spirits associated with those animals. And what's interesting is that these masks are distributed all the way across West Africa, from Mali and the edge of Senegal down into Liberia, Sierra Leone, all the way across to Cameroon. There are at least 30 ethnic groups or tribes that have this kind of mask, but each group has its own stylistic inflection. These two masks are from two different peoples, but they are neighboring peoples in the Benue Valley, and they're just across the Benue River from one another, so they obviously borrowed the same form back and forth. But what is most interesting about this phenomenon of the three-part horizontal mask, composite mask, is that the functions were the same. The meanings were the same. They all had to do with purifying the human community, with ridding the community of evil influences, of witches, of sorcerers, of people who were antisocial, who were out to hurt other people in various ways. And they were deputized in many instances by councils of elders and leaders to identify these errant, antisocial, and disruptive people and to bring them to trial. The masquerader didn't necessarily bring them to trial, but they were so identified. And these masks would go out into the community. They were feared because of the fearsome powers of the bush animals that they represented. And so most of us in the field think that this is a kind of very early form of masquerade because it's so widely dispersed and diffused across West Africa. Other masks are, all masks, of course, are entertaining one way or another. Some of them parody and are satirize different human foibles. The Poe Masks in particular, from a small subgroup which is very distinctive stylistically among the Ebo people, as I said, right along the Cross River. The Poe Masks are used in skits that are sometimes quite elaborate, and they will reenact village scenes of women who are trying to become too uppity in the eyes of the men who dance these masks. By the way, almost all of these masks are danced only by men. They may represent women, but they're danced only by men. Although a graduate student of mine discovered that in northeastern Ebo country, women had started to dance this mask, which is a very, very rare instance of that happening. In Sierra Leone and Liberia, there's an enclave of ethnic groups where women dance masks, but most of West Africa and the Congo, masks are danced only by men. Okay, where was I now? I was talking about satire among the Afikpo. So in the 1950s, when the great anthropologist Simon Ottenberg was doing his work on the Afikpo, women were hearing a little bit about women's lib, and they didn't want to. I mean, African cultures are severely paternalistic, you should know. And women need to stay in their places, as they are supposed to in our culture too, but don't, thankfully. Anyway, so women were beginning to become quite wealthy as traders, and men were jealous of this. And so they would put on skits mimicking the women as traders and trying to shame the women away from being traders or being as independent as the women wanted to be in this area. Or they would look at a man who drank too much or who was a womanizer or who was greedy, and they would lampoon these people in skits, and they would name them. And the people who were lampooned and satirized were meant to actually give the masquerader tips. They were meant to reward the masquerader for being pilloried publicly in the human community, which I think is quite wonderful. But so these satires, and there were many different versions of them in the skits performed by these young men, Poe, were quite dramatic and quite colorful, very entertaining, very funny, and but skits and satire are known in masquerades all over West Africa. That's certainly true of both Egungun, which are ancestral masks, and Gala Day Masks, which are masks danced for the mothers among the Yoruba. And we have examples of both. The left-hand mask here is a Gala Day mask, and almost certainly represents a woman with a head tie, a cloth head tie on. And the Gala Day Society is a male society that is constituted to honor women, Yoruba women, who are our mothers, as the Yoruba put it. And of course, women are our mothers, and women should be honored. But this is a particularly wonderful masquerade that honors women in the community, and there are different local versions of the Gala Day Society in each community, by skits and by a series of different masks that represent almost the world of human society. There are animal masks, there are traders, there are diviners, there are fishermen, all represented by these masked characters. And then the Egungun Society, which is a masquerade that honors ancestors, put on what is called a display of miracles, and they create all kinds of pantomimes and different things. They will have, for example, a masquerader that's entirely of cloth, and he will swirl the cloth around and turn a blue cloth, which is white on the inside. Through its dancing, it will turn it into a white cloth just before your eyes. So this is one of the miracles that is wrought by the ancestral masquerades. The mask just to the right of the gentleman in the white t-shirt, which you can point out there with a hairstyle, yeah, that's right, a hairstyle that comes off to the side, is owned by a family of hunters. And this is referred to as the hunter's hairstyle. The three masks further along are involved in the Gala Day Masquerade's evening performance, which is also some satirical dances. And of course, all of these dances are accompanied by music. All of the masks have elaborate costumes. The Gala Day, for example, often the women Gala Day masqueraders have wonderful bustles that come out the back and huge breasts, sometimes great big bullet breasts, And they are simultaneously, the Gala Day masqueraders, simultaneously honoring women and to some extent caricaturing them at the same time. And these two things are okay to happen simultaneously in African activity. Human figures, of which there is a shrine grouping here and a photograph of a similarly styled group of figures in southern Ebo country. Human figures, for the most part, represent deities and sometimes with an ancestral component. The Mumuye that I spoke of earlier, unfortunately, not a whole lot is known, despite a fair amount of field work in that area, about the meanings and uses of Mumuye figures, but they certainly come out of shrines, as these figures certainly did as well. And the Yoruba staff, which is behind the lady with the turquoise vest, this Yoruba staff here is a female devil god of thunder and lightning among the Yoruba. Shango is his name. And the bow tie-like form at the top of that is a stylized representation. This form right here is a stylized representation of a thunder celt, a Neolithic stone axe, doubled in this case, and that's one of the signature items of the god of thunder and lightning. Other Yoruba shrine figures, the two small figures to the left of the Shango staff, which is actually a dance wand that is carried by a Shango devotee in dances to honor Shango, and sometimes the carrier of that staff will become possessed by the deity and go into a kind of trance state. The two small figures are Ibeji, or twins, and they are memorial figures for deceased twins. The Yoruba have a very, very high incident of twin births, the highest known in the world. Some figures say that the Yoruba have 33 twin births per 1,000 births. White Caucasian Americans have 11 twin births per 1,000, at least when these figures were compiled. I don't know what the latest figures are. African Americans have 16 twin births per 1,000. The Bamana people of Mali have 30 twin births. This is the closest ethnic group to the 33 twin births per 1,000. But the Yoruba, for reasons that have never been figured out, have a huge number of twin births. And many centuries ago, they used to discard twins and throw them into the bad bush, as it's referred to. And then someone had the brilliant idea that twins really should be revered, and the mothers of twins should be rewarded for giving birth to these doubled human beings. So that there came a cultural transformation when twins went from being despised to being appreciated and honored. And at that time, probably in the mid-18th century, according to Yoruba historians, mothers of twins, or the families of twins, whenever a twin died, would go to a professional carver and have an image created of that twin, and his soul was consecrated into the figure, and the figure, or the two figures, if they both died in childbirth, for example, which was not uncommon, both figures were cared for by the family in a local family shrine. So we're going all the way from family shrines with these twins to community shrines, such as the shrine that the Shango staff would be housed in, or community shrines where these Ebo figures would be housed. And these shrines among the Ebo people were for nature deities, markets, days of the week, the god of war, the earth goddess, and so forth. And looking at the figures, it's impossible to tell what deity they were dedicated to. Were they figures of deities? No. They were considered the children of deities. They were considered symbols of the deities. But when I asked an Ebo man if these represented real deities, he said, nobody knows what these deities look like. The only person who knows what a god looks like is a dead person, which I thought was quite a sage comment. There are two masks here that I'd like to talk a bit about. This mask and this one. These are two Ebo masks. And this mask has undergone some changes historically. It started off as a female mask with 3 crests, and you can see those crests, they're still there. And it was probably danced for a while as a maiden spirit mask, which is a mask with a white face with 3 hair crests that are more elaborate in masks than they were ever in life. And then someone decided to aggrandize this mask a little bit by adding human figures to the top. And so these human figures were all inserted and pegged in or nailed into the top of this mask to transform it into probably a mother mask, a mask that represents a woman maybe that had given birth to several children and who was therefore more important in the hierarchy of females than a young unmarried girl would have been. But the base mask is a white-faced mask with a very thin nose that represents simultaneously a young girl, an unmarried, beautiful young girl, and an ancestor. Ancestors among the Ebo are called the Incarnate Dead, and they are not named ancestors. They're not people that you knew, Uncle George who died a few decades ago, or Granddad. They are the remote ancestors who were responsible for creating the village in the first place. So this mask has become aggrandized, but it still betrays its origin as a maiden mask. And it is opposed conceptually among the Ebo of the northeastern region by this mask, which is a male composite animal mask, analogous because of the multiple horns to the other horned composite masks that we looked at earlier, but with a colonial officer standing and holding on to the central bush cow horns here. Always dark, always, or almost always, larger than the female counterparts. These represent the powers of the bush, the powers of and the dangers of the wilderness. They frequently have multiple teeth, snaggled teeth, and sometimes their faces are made deliberately ugly as opposed to the symmetrical, fine-featured young girl mask. So we have a dualistic opposition of the order of the village, the order of civilization, and these masks are always danced in very fancy cloth, as opposed to the powers of the bush, the powers of the wilderness, and these masks have heavy, smelly raffia attached to them, and dark costumes, and they dance often with very heavy, lumbering steps, whereas these young men who dance the maidens are dancing girls' dance steps. And this is an opposition that exists in many, many parts of West Africa in particular, but also into the Congo as well. The opposite, I refer to it as Beauty and the Beast, because that's basically what it is. And usually it's a young girl and a middle-aged or older So I refer to it as the pretty young girl and the dirty old man. It's an extremely widespread opposition and masquerade theme or meme in Nigeria. And most of the peoples surrounding the Ebo have that same light versus dark, pretty versus ugly dichotomy. And they play out. Sometimes they play in the same arena, but mostly it's a conceptual opposition, and they will dance quite separately from one another. Because each shrine is constituted differently, either in a family compound or in the community center, where there will be a whole compound devoted to these, as this is in a kind of a community shrine in the center of a village. Sometimes they're distributed to the different compounds of lineage compounds in the community, and people take care of them in different ways. White is the color among the Ebo of purity and goodness, associated with the purity of young virginal girls, for example, and that's why the face is white. It has nothing to do with white people, by the way. And not infrequently, the figures which are painted by women, they're carved by men, invariably. All the carvings here are the products of male effort. And wherever there's painting, it's usually women who do the painting. Why are they dressed? Modesty, I suppose. I don't know. Sometimes they're dressed. This shrine figure, I was looking at it earlier, none of the figures in this shrine have wrappers or loincloths on, but in another shrine, not more than a few miles from that one, I have a photograph where all of the figures have white loincloths on. So it was the choice of the priest or priestess in charge of the shrine whether to paint or repaint. And sometimes they had annual ceremonies where they would bring the statues of the deities out into the community and offer sacrifices to them, kola nut, sometimes blood sacrifices. They'd kill a chicken, drip the blood in front of the figure, or sometimes on the figure, to feed the deities. So they are invented spirits. The carvings are invented. The styles are invented. This particular style is quite distinctive, long-legged, but quite short and geometrically treated arms. So they're rectilinear at the top, but long-legged, and always with a long neck, as you can see in all of these. Now, these two may very well have come out together and have been carved by the same artist, but these two were undoubtedly from different shrines, and they've been grouped together by our curator because they're all from the same style area, and this is quite appropriate that they should be so grouped. They're cared for, they are worshipped, and these shrines serve as points of contact between our world and the spirit world, whether that is the world of ancestors who in Africa are revered and sacrificed to, or whether it's the world of the nearer nature gods, the gods of the sky, of the earth, of local markets, of phenomena that are nearby, local rivers and so forth, are incarnated in these deities. All of these peoples believe in a high God with a capital G, but this deity, while mentioned in prayers, is very, very rarely imaged in the arts and is rarely petitioned directly. Human petitions operate through what we might refer to as the saints, these deity figures that have to do with certain branches of nature or human activity, such as markets, the crossroads, thunder and lightning, or rainfall, the sky, the earth, and so forth. Many direct sacrifices are made to these latter deities, and those are the ones represented by these, the statuary. How do they come to be here? It's a very good question, and it's a difficult question, because many of them come to be here for lots of different reasons. Among the Yoruba, there has been a very, very strong Islamization movement. So Islam has moved from northern Nigeria down into Yoruba country, and as soon as the people convert to Islam, they will give up their figurative sculpture. And usually these days they'll sell it to local dealers who will sell it to European or American dealers who will sell it to us. And they will objects will go to collectors who will sometimes give them to the Williams College Museum of Art. Yes?
Could you talk a little bit about the role of the artisan in these societies, both in antiquity and modern times? Do people make a living being artists?
Some do today, but those who are making a living today are turning out tourist arts or copies or sometimes even fakes that are sold as old objects. They are antiqued and made to look old, made to look as though they've been used for a long time. But there are cottage industries in most African countries where tourists go, such as Kenya, Tanzania, Mali, before the unrest in Mali, recent unrest in Mali, Nigeria and Cameroon and so forth. These are professional artists. Many have inherited the trade in their families. Their fathers were master artists. They apprenticed just as kids, and they started by blocking out the statuary, handing it to the master carver, and eventually they would carve on their own. Artists are treated pluralistically in African cultures. Many Yoruba artists became very famous in their own lifetimes and were commissioned by different kingdoms, and the artists moved from their hometown to a kingdom that might be 30, 40 miles away to execute house posts and doors for the palace. Among the Ijaw peoples, and we have no Ijaw art represented here, who live in the Niger Delta, artists, and this is largely a fishing community, the Ijaw are fishermen. Artists are those people who were not able-bodied enough to go to farm or to go fishing, and they were sometimes crippled. And so the artists were not particularly revered among the Ijaw people. They did beautiful work, but they were not respected. Ebo artists were sort of mixed. Some were quite well respected and quite well known in their lifetimes, but rarely in Africa, among Africans themselves, is there much of an emphasis on the artist as a personality. This is something that has developed only in the Western world, only quite recently, right? And individual hands, while we can recognize them quite easily, I can say for sure that this hand is different from this hand. But they would say, oh, you know, those were done by our forefathers. They wouldn't identify necessarily the person who carved, even if they knew who made it. And then in the case of a masked being who has a mask, a costume, objects held in the hands, sometimes scarves that are borrowed from the women. There are several people involved. There's a male tailor who does the costume, which is very important, a male carver who creates the mask, and then women who have lent items of their own clothing to help dress the masquerader to turn it into a pretty young girl. So all the public religious organizations or cults had priests or priestesses, sometimes both, who officiated, who gathered people together for sacrifices, for prayer. And some deities even had slaves. People who ran to the compound of a deity for the protection of that deity. This is in the old days, in probably pre-colonial times, although there was still a cult slave living in an Ebo community in 1966 when I first did my research among the Ebo. As most of you know, the African peoples themselves were slave traders and slave holders. It's not just we in the West who were responsible for slavery. Slavery is a very widespread institution still on the continent of Africa, unfortunately. So, yes, there were priests for major cults, and a mother of twins, for example, would serve as the priestess for her own collection of twins, the family collection of twins. And there are photographs taken by some of my colleagues that show 10 or 15 twin figures, all placed, many of them dressed carefully with food placed in front of them, sacrificial food, because these deities, whether twins or the god of a local river, are cared for and honored by the human community, given periodic food and drink, symbolically, as we symbolically give ourselves food and drink associated with our gods. Well, Christianity entered Africa in the late 15th century. And we have conversions in Congo in the late 1400s. From the Congo peoples, mouth of the Congo River, sent the king of Congo, sent his sons to Portugal to be ordained as a Catholic priest. The influence of Christianity in the lower Congo region is deep and profound and long. They cast crucifixes locally. Many people think that the so-called nail fetishes, the power figures that are from that area, are associated with human reliquaries and so forth. So Christianity has had a deep and profound and pervasive impact. The Yoruba, for example, professional Yoruba carvers were commissioned by the Catholic Church to do doors and house posts for Catholic churches in Western Yoruba country. So many Protestant and Catholic priests in southern Nigeria were opposed to the arts because they were associated with what they thought of as paganism, with polytheism and so forth. And some of them tried to gather the objects together and burn them, and did. Other priests, like Father Kevin Carroll among the Yoruba, encouraged local carvers and so forth. Islam has been mostly a damper for the traditional arts, and a number of the objects that are here are the result of encroaching Islam. Many of them are also here by virtue of the Nigeria-Biafra civil war that some of you will remember, that took place between 1967 and 1970, when Biafra tried to secede from Nigeria. And Biafra is this area of southeastern Nigeria where I was working, and I actually was in Biafra at the start of that civil war. And thousands of objects were exported during and right after that civil war. Literally thousands upon thousands of objects. Many of them were exported into Cameroon, which is the neighboring country here, and were exported to Europe and to the States. There were European and possibly some American dealers who stationed themselves in southern Nigeria during the war to collect these objects from peoples who had fled their villages and left the art behind. So this was one of the major sources of art from southern Nigeria. Okay, I want to finish up by talking about the art in this room. I quote an African-American scholar and poet, well, used to be called Leroy Jones, who said, "Hunting is not those heads on the wall." And I say, masks are not these heads in the gallery. Masking, the masquerade, is a dynamic and active performance genre, activated by music and the dance, by costume, by crowds of people who warm the masqueraders up. It is a totally different experience to see a mask behind plexiglass mounted on a stand in a gallery in the West. So in a sense, these are strangers to us. They are strangers in that they are within our culture, yes, but they are representatives of Ebo culture of 30, 40, 50 years ago. Now over here, in this absolutely marvelous figure here of a European riding a bicycle, and it's absolutely certain that he's riding a bicycle, although that really looks nothing like a bicycle. Here we have what is clearly a kind of honorific, if you will, caricature of a very upright European with a long pointed nose riding a bicycle, which has been reconstituted entirely as a work of art. And the whimsy, the sense of humor, the grace, the feeling that goes into this little carving, which probably was made in the 20s or 30s, possibly the 40s. Do we have a date on that at all? Do you have a date? The 30s, okay. I think it's wonderful. It was, why did the carver make it? Who did he make it for? We don't know. Did he make it for a European? Probably not. He was obviously a master carver. He was very good at his trade. He probably kept it in his house. He probably had friends over who admired it and laughed at it and said, there's that guy. There's that white guy that we know about who has invaded our culture. But here he is back with us, the white guy who has helped to amass this collection. And there's some wonderful ironies here and some dynamic trade-offs between their values and ours as we look at these carvings, which are, for me, inspirational. And I hope I've given you a little bit of feeling for what they might have been like in their African communities. Thank you. Thanks all for coming.